And our last speaker is John R. Pottenger, who is a professor and chair of political science in the political science department of philosophy by Courtesy University of Alabama in Huntsville. His area of expertise is analytical political philosophy, classical medieval and modern political philosophy, American political thought, political theology and hermeneutics, and public policy and ethics. His books are on liberal democracy and the religious axis from 2007, and on the political theory and liberal theology before that.
Liberation theology, but that's all right. Good afternoon. I think my time is running out.
No, we're going to prolong the session a bit because we started.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just so long as everybody knows. If I see you walking out, I don't know why. And I enjoyed that last presentation. I'm not sure shifting to politics might not be desacralizing something that you said, but we'll, I guess we'll risk it. I wrote a 30-page paper, but I obviously don't have time to give it, so with some wise advice, I chopped it down to 10 and maybe less. And so I think to get most of the points across the best that I can, I would prefer to read more than just tell, although I'd prefer to tell more than read. I think it'd be more interesting, but we'll lose something in translation, so to speak. So what I'm talking about is the political theology of what's known as Christian Reconstructionism. And just to give you a little bit about that, it probably hit its apogee of influence in late 1980s, 90s, but it has since extended dramatically into American evangelical Christianity. I'm talking about this from an American phenomenon. And that has shifted dramatically our politics in this country, including to the present administration of Donald Trump. Or at least there are signs of it in his, among his advisors and appointees. So what is it? It's an attempt to reconstruct Christian theology and reconstruct all societies worldwide according to the Reconstructionist idea of a non-dispensationalist theology. That is, God has not changed. There are no dispensations, as we heard about in some of the other presentations. And to base all civil, political, religious, family, community, economic laws on the 10 Commandments and the other 603, or whatever the number is now, laws in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament for him, for them. That is, all of the laws, particularly in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, are case law that help explain the 10 Commandments, and they should be followed. I don't want to say religiously. They should be followed completely in every way, aside from perhaps the non-ceremonial laws. I mean, only the non-ceremonial laws. So, let me just start reading some of this, and I think you'll see the point. Their political theology has 3 different parts, and I'll let you know as soon as I get to that. Along with other conservative evangelical Christians who collectively made up the Christian right of the late 20th century and now into the 21st century, Christian Reconstructionism emerged from the Reformed theology tradition in alarm at the growth of the secular state's regulations in economic and political life, as well as the dissemination of liberal social programs that promoted humanist values in civil society. progenitor of Reconstructionism was Calvinist theologian and former pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, Rusus John Rushdoony. In their social criticisms, Rushdoony and other Reconstructionists fault the prevailing mainline Christian denominations whose errant interpretation of biblical covenants and teachings have been supportive of the view that a society based on democracy, materialism, diversity, and tolerance is morally legitimate, which they are not from this point of view. The error, they argue, is that the denominations, whether Catholic or Protestant or anything else, have succumbed to the temptation of embracing the social contract theory of civil society, or what they call contractualism, which has become the dominant view of the modern world. The philosophy of contractualism, which is the dominant view of the modern world, I think I read that sentence twice, assumes a hypothetical as real transfer of each individual's political sovereignty to the state. The state maintains orderly society based solely on legal contracts into which individuals have entered voluntarily. The Reconstructionists argue that contractualism's transfer of individual sovereignty denies any underlying metaphysical reality or transcendent social order, and thus supplants the tradition of Christian covenantalism. The imperative then for Reconstructionists, as I said, is to move the foundation of society, all institutions worldwide, away from contractualism to covenantalism of the Old Testament. Reconstructionists maintain that the prophets of the Bible expected believers to accept covenantalism as the foundation upon which civil society would be built and work toward the institutionalization in all nations of the biblical covenants and their case laws contained in the Holy Scriptures, both Hebrew and Christian, to achieve a godly society. In fact, until all nations have fully reconstructed the foundations of their cultural, civil, social, economic, and political institutions in line with Hebrew, what they call Theonomy, that is God's law, would there be the advent of the second coming of Christ. These are post-millennialists. They're not pre-millennialists like most Christians. I'll come to that in a minute. To this end, Reconstructionists call for the reconstruction of Christian theology to combat the forces of humanism and statism necessary to advance the reconstruction of political society in preparation for the parousia, second coming. As I read their writings, Reconstructionist political theology incorporates three key methods in its foundational theology and political philosophy. The first one is pre-prepositional apologetics and covenantal hermeneutics. The second is theonomy and political ethics. And the third is post-millennial eschatology and dominionism. So let's look at the first one all pretty briefly, but we'll look at them. Presuppositional apologetics and covenantal hermeneutics. During the movement's formative years, the Christian Reconstructionists found their political theological inspiration in Calvinist presuppositional apologetics, particularly as interpreted in the late 18th century, early 19th century Dutch Reformed theology of Abraham Kuyper. Kuyper relied on John Calvin's interpretation of Jesus' references to the kingdom of God as demanding that Christians bring all aspects of life, including politics, under the reign and lordship of Jesus Christ. The Reconstructionists established their epistemic justification for Kuyper's New Calvinism in the Reformed epistemology of Cornelius Van Til, who had also been influenced by Kuyper's arguments. Van Til builds on and expands the apologetics of Kuyper and Calvin to assert the following. All of creation reveals God's handiwork. The divine seed of religion is sown in each individual. And all individuals are capable of grasping God's plan of salvation and His presence in the world. Whether they know it or not, they have it. They just have to be told and conform. In this way, the intent of Christian apologetics is a vindication of the Christian philosophy of life against the various forms of non-Christian philosophies of life. Using some of their quotations here. To begin the vindication process, Van Til asserts that the Christian philosophy of life begins with certain presuppositions. To argue by presupposition is to indicate what are the epistemological and metaphysical principles that underlie and control one's method. He says, he proclaims that the epistemology and metaphysics of any legitimate method that attempts to understand the world must begin with the presupposition that the Bible is universally comprehensive and inerrant, and as such is the basis of all facts, including those exhibited in the disciplines of science, history, and logic, and others. Given these presuppositions, especially with regard to biblical covenants and laws as a starting point to develop a legitimate theology, Reconstructionists have developed a hermeneutics to interpret Old Testament case law in order to distinguish its judicial continuity from discontinuity in the two testaments. Their hermeneutics relies on three basic principles. Seems to me it's really two, but they say it's three. Identify the primary function of an old covenant, that is Old Testament, that is Hebrew Bible law, and then discover whether it is universal in a redemptive, healing sense, or whether it is conditional by its redemptive historical context, that is annulled by the new covenant. Specifically, if the primary intent of the law in Leviticus or Deuteronomy or any of the other books of the Pentateuch and even other books of the Old Testament, or claims or normative claims. If the law applied only within the territorial boundaries of ancient Israel to meet its particular economic, social, or other needs, then the law was conditional and thus applicable only to ancient Israel, not to be applied universally. Conversely, according to the Reconstructionists, given that conditionally bound and historically situated laws do not exhibit judicial or covenantal continuity into the New Testament, laws without specifically stated delimitations of boundaries must be presumed to exhibit covenantal and judicial continuity beyond the Old Testament, and they are not automatically annulled by the New Testament scriptures. In addition, they claim the New Testament itself reveals that the Old Testament prophecies of a Messiah to save Israel were fulfilled with the physical and spiritual life and death of Jesus Christ. Israel, however, had apostatized from its universal covenants and refused to recognize and accept Jesus as the Messiah. The advent and sacrifice of Christ disinherited ancient Israel as the chosen people and transferred the biblical covenants to the Christian church. A quotation from one of them: the church is the kingdom prophesied in the Old Testament era and is a millennial age. It is composed of Jew and Gentile merged into one body in Christ as the new Israel of God. To comprehend the Bible, again, I'm skipping through if it's a little choppy. That's the reason. To comprehend the Bible's story of salvation after having identified the biblical laws that serve as timeless covenants, Reconstructionists presuppose three characteristics of biblical law that are necessary for their political theology. The first characteristic is the divine revelatory essence of all biblical law. While Torah is the Hebrew word for law, which means instruction, authoritative direction, Reconstructionists maintain that the biblical concept of law is broader than the legal codes of Mosaic formulations. Let me skip down. Secondly, the Ten Commandments and the case law predicated upon them are not only revealed law, but as revelations must be understood literally as treaties or covenants between God and man. All men and women, all human beings. And the final characteristic of the biblical law or covenant is that it constitutes a plan for dominion under God. In their exegesis of normative content in the biblical laws as divine revelation, Reconstructionists find that the command to Adam to subdue and have dominion over the earth constitutes a commandment of all men, for all men, that is, to do that. 5 5 minutos es ahí. All right, well, sorry, no, you're right.
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Well, let's see, I'm on page 9. How do I get to 30? All right. Let me go much more quickly. I timed this and thought I had it set up, but I guess not. So the second part is theonomy and political ethics. Any non-Christian epistemology in respect of hermeneutics are by definition anti-Christian. There is no neutral ground. Either you're with them or you're against them. Obedience to biblical law, including the non-ceremonials. Okay, I've already mentioned that. All right, I won't go into homosexuality, which is punishable by death. I won't go into children talking back to the parents, which is punishable by death. I won't go into a variety of things that the Reconstructionists, and I'm not trying to give them short shrift here, I'm just short on time. The point is that the role of government is to enforce the biblical laws in all countries, all the time, worldwide, before Jesus comes. Jesus can't come until the world has been made holy. They're post-millennialist. Not premillennialist, as most Christians are today, although that was different in the 19th century in the United States. So the point is that is the political, that's what gives Reconstructionists their political edge, and increasingly more and more for evangelical Christians, that, well, Jesus can't come back until we create a godly society, so we better get to work. We'd better start, bringing the Jews on board. They'll convert sooner or later. Just saying. That's sort of their...
Started with Chabad.
Yeah. So whenever that happens, the millennium is not meant to be literal, it's meant to be figurative, right? So the millennium started when Jesus came and died. Came, taught, suffered, sacrificed, died. Now the millennium started. It's not 1,000 years, it's a long time. Many cultures have that idea of a big number is just not meant to be accurate, it's just meant to mean it's a lot, right? So you've got to start by working within any political system you're in. In the United States, they'll work within the idea of religious freedom. They don't like the idea of religious freedom, religious pluralism. It's a fraud. It's meant to harm Christianity by saying anything goes. But they want to take advantage of it, extend it as much as they can, start pushing homeschooling, Christian homeschooling, take kids out of the public schools, set up the churches to be a shadow government, so when the liberal democracy fails, they're ready to take over, and do what they can in terms of the courts to move that along. Subterfuge, but it works. So then the postmillennial eschatology, I sort of combine that with the other one, but again, that seems to me to be the underlying political, or the underlying power that gives them the politics to move forward and for the political theology and to try to control or take over the world for the well-being of everybody, right? In other words, God said it, it's in the Old Testament, it's right there. You have the Ten Commandments, all the case law. Jesus didn't abrogate any of that. Go forward with that. This is what he wants, and society will be better. So maybe I better stop right there. I have a couple pages to say about Trump, but if you don't want to hear it, that's okay. It really has to do with people in his administration who are part of this. Kellyanne Conway, Steve Bannon, Betsy DeVos, the new Secretary of Education, and others, and even Trump himself mentioning a phrase that the Reconstructionists have always said: the problem with liberal democracy is that individuals begin worshiping the government, and the government acts like it's sovereign, and only God is sovereign. And Trump the other day, about 2 weeks ago, said, we don't worship government, we worship God. So it's a common saying among Reconstructionists. I just told you what he said. I don't know what to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Reconstructionism is not really making it. Do you think there's any chance that it will make it?
I think, you have the Seven Mountains Dominionism
Yeah.
that Raphael Cruz, the father of Ted Cruz, was promoting, and a lot of individuals have noticed that Ted Cruz has used that kind of language. But to get to your point, in saying that, as a movement, Christian Reconstructionism kind of fizzled out, but not its teachings. And I have found more websites and individuals and books. I mean, they're all over the map now with these ideas. And I think it's two things that the individuals may not call themselves Reconstructionists, but they are clearly, Bob Jones University has a variety of publications, so if you want to start homeschooling your children, you use exactly this apologetics and hermeneutics in deciding how to teach your children. The first thing is that the Bible has to be the presupposition you start with. Wherever you go, that's the first thing. It's true, it's right, it doesn't change. And it applies to everybody. And homeschooling in the United States, as you know, is growing leaps and bounds, and particularly among Christian families. I'm not saying they all teach it the same way, but more and more seem to be using those kinds of texts that came out of this influence of Reconstructionism back in the 80s and 90s. And the second thing would be one of Trump's lawyers that he's asked to help defend him in case he has problems, Jay Sekulow, is a Reconstructionist, and his legal firm started with support from Rushdoony, and there are other units like that who are trying to defend Christians in the public square, stop the persecution of what they see of Christians in the United States by liberal or secular or humanist kinds of attitudes and policies and state laws and the like, and see if they can't find ways to use the law to expand Christian rights as they see it, or Christian liberty. And I think of the Hobby Lobby case a year or two ago. First time that a company by the U.S. Supreme Court was accorded religious rights. I'm not talking about other rights. They've already been accorded since the 19th century, property rights and the like. But more and more treating companies as people. And I think the case out of Missouri came out in favor of that Christian or Methodist school that wanted to use funds by the state to put in a new playground for their kids. And I believe the Supreme Court last week supported them. So there's more and more. It doesn't mean they're all Reconstructionists, but this idea of finding more ways to expand Christian rights, to break down the law or the wall of separation, however it may be perceived. Roger Williams started that, I think. Then Locke found it, and then Jefferson found it. So I think those two things are at the place where they are because the Reconstructionists were so strong in pushing it.
Is it the same as the dominationists?
There's dominionists.
Dominionists, sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's related to that. The Reconstructionists certainly have that. Others have that too. And they crossbreed. They share, theologies with each other. They may disagree.
What's the difference with the
Well, the Reconstructionists have the dominionism in it.
Okay.
And others might say, well, we just want that.
Okay.
We don't need some of the rest. And they may still be dispensationalists. Like, seems to me, as was pointed out, perhaps you pointed it out, or somebody else in another panel. from the 19th century, the dispensationalism of God and revelation over time. And the Reconstructionists don't see that, but many Christians still do.
Okay, so, yeah.
Could I ask, is there any evidence that it's influenced by popular culture, the kind of modern day conspiracy theories, the lack of faith in government, the idea that they're being attacked by a kind of new world order, a homogenous idea? Does this, you mentioned that it had fizzled out, is there any evidence to say that the kind of pop culture is bringing it back?
If so, I don't think it would be in the same way. I think it fizzled out primarily because of the harshness that comes across. You know, if your children talk back to you, you're obligated to stone them to death.
To stone them to death?
Yeah.
What do they actually do?
Say it again?
Obviously.
Oh, no, they don't do it, but they think that the state should be in a position where that is the proper. God said it, right? It's there in their interpretation, right? I've got all the scriptures from Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and some of the others in my paper if you want me to send you a copy. It's 30 pages, sorry. But
One last comment or question?
Yeah, it's a major question, so you're free to ignore it. But
I'm not one of them, if that's what you
no,
just
no,
want to get their
no,
point
no,
across.
it's not that direction. What I'm saying is this kind of reminds me of the concept of utopia as an actual political project that became prominent in the 19th, 18th, and the beginning of the 20th century. The idea that we can reconstruct the world, it was mostly done by seculars, but still, reconstruct the world to make it a perfect place. Would you say it's kind of parallel to such an utopic concept, even if it has a later stage of Jesus returning?
I suppose there's, you could take it to its logical conclusion of a utopia. But I think of the postmillennialists in the 19th century, at least in the United States. Many of these efforts to improve the lot of people in prison, to have public schools, to argue for rights for women, many of these are coming out of religious movements. And they were postmillennialists to a degree. At least the idea, even among Mormons, the idea that we ought to see if we can't build a good society here and now. Whenever Jesus comes, he comes. But the idea that we can do it now, we don't have to wait for the 1,000 years when Satan is bound, and et cetera, et cetera. But I could see where for some this would be the logical conclusion, at least for the Reconstructionists. They're still out there. They're still writing. They've got lots of websites, lots of books, lots of free stuff, supporting a lot of these. I mentioned a number of the legal defense organizations in the paper that are trying to expand the presence and influence of Christianity. It's sort of like we don't have a state religion in the United States, but the Protestants, and a lot of it for very good reasons, have virtually made it Protestantism roughly almost a state religion. Almost, not quite. And this would probably move in that direction. And the other fellow who's here, and he's left, when he's talking about Jews being Protestantized, Mark Roloff in his book, The Poverty of American Politics, talks about that. And Catholics, Jews, Muslims, everybody, by the time they get to America and get acculturated, have been Protestantized. And you can call yourself what you want, whatever club you want to belong to, but you still have the same values. What's in it for me? How much money can I make? Am I going to get a good job? Are the kids going to be well educated? And they just reinterpret their religions in terms of sort of the Protestant work ethic and the like.
Thank you very much.